Australia is making some serious moves when it comes to unlawful citizens. We're talking deportations, crackdowns, and some spicy new laws that have human rights groups raising their eyebrows so high they might just take off. The government isn't playing around, and if you don't have your paperwork in order, you could find yourself on the next flight out. Now, before we dive in, let's set the scene. You're in Australia, you love the beaches, you've developed an unhealthy obsession with meat pies, and you think drop bears might actually be real. But there's one problem. You don't have a valid visa. Uh-oh. That makes you what's called an unlawful non-citizen, and that's not a club you want to be in. The Australian government has been tightening the screws on immigration laws, making it easier to detain and deport those without proper documentation. Even minor criminal offences can now be grounds for deportation, sparking debates about fairness and human rights. So whether you're a tourist overstaying your welcome or someone caught in visa limbo, the message is clear. Sort it out, or you might be packing your bag sooner than you think. Mandatory detention, no visa, no freedom. Australia has a pretty clear stance. If you're in the country without a valid visa, whether you arrived without one, overstayed, or had your visa cancelled, you're getting detained. No get-out-of-jail-free card here, as the government takes immigration law seriously, and there's little room for exceptions. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so they detain people, but surely they let them go after a while, right? Nope. If you're caught without a visa, you have two options. Secure a new one, which is about as easy as finding a kangaroo in downtown Sydney, or face deportation. And deportation isn't just a possibility, it's the default outcome. Australia's immigration detention system is strict, and once you're in, it can be tough to get out. Detention centres are designed to hold unlawful non-citizens while their cases are processed, and for many that means waiting indefinitely. Human rights groups have raised concerns about the conditions and the mental toll on detainees, but the government remains firm. So, whether you lost track of your visa expiry date or thought you could slip under the radar, Australia's message is clear. No visa, no stay. Once you're flagged as an unlawful non-citizen, the government doesn't waste time. Mandatory arrest, detention, and eventual removal. It's all part of the process. Australia's immigration system is strict, and there's little wiggle room once you're on their radar. And if you think you can just dig your heels in and refuse to leave, think again. New legislation has made non-compliance a serious offence. Authorities now have the power to issue you a prison sentence if you don't cooperate. So it's not just deportation anymore, it's deportation with a potential side of jail time.
And action.
The government's message is crystal clear. If you're in Australia without a valid visa, you won't be staying for long. Whether you leave voluntarily or in handcuffs, the outcome remains the same. So, if you're in visa limbo, it's best to sort things out before the authorities do it for you. Australia introduced the Migration Amendment, Removal and Other Measures Bill. And let's be honest, it sounds like something straight out of a dystopian novel. This law significantly strengthens the government's ability to enforce removals, making it even harder for unlawful non-citizens to remain in the country. Under this legislation, if someone refuses to comply with deportation orders, they're not just facing removal, they could also end up behind bars. The message is clear: cooperate or face the consequences. Critics argue that this approach is harsh, punishing individuals who may already be in vulnerable situations. But the government insists that stricter enforcement is necessary to maintain immigration control. Whether you see it as a necessary measure or an extreme crackdown, one thing is certain: Australia isn't making it easy for unlawful non-citizens to stick around. So who's on the chopping block? Non-citizens can be deported if 1. They've committed a serious crime and received at least a year in prison. 2. They failed the infamous character test, which, despite sounding like something from Hogwarts, is actually a legal assessment of whether someone poses a risk to the community. 3, their visa expired, was cancelled, or they entered the country illegally. In short, if you're not following the rules, Australia is ready to hand you a return to sender label. The government isn't taking chances when it comes to unlawful non-citizens, and they've made it easier than ever to detain and deport those who don't meet their standards. Supporters argue this keeps communities safe, while critics claim it unfairly targets vulnerable individuals. Either way, one thing is clear: Australia isn't messing around when it comes to immigration enforcement. Now, here's where things get even wilder. The government is exploring laws that would allow them to deport people to third countries instead of their home nation. Imagine this. You're from country A, you come to Australia, but instead of sending you back to country A, Australia ships you off to country B instead. And if something bad happens to you there, well, Australia just shrugs and says, "Not our problem, mate." Yep, that's part of the plan, granting the government immunity from lawsuits if deportees face harm in a third country. Critics argue this is a dangerous move that puts people at serious risk, especially those fleeing conflict or persecution. But officials insist it's about maintaining strict immigration control and preventing people from gaming the system. If these laws go through, deportation from Australia might not just mean going home. It could mean ending up somewhere you never expected. Not everyone is thrilled about these new laws. Human rights groups argue that indefinite detention, fast-track deportations, and third-country removals violate international protections for asylum seekers and migrants. They claim the government is prioritizing strict border enforcement over basic human rights. However, supporters of the new policies argue that immigration laws must be enforced to protect national security and prevent visa overstayers from exploiting loopholes. To them, the laws aren't about cruelty, they're about control. Regardless of where you stand, one thing is clear: Australia is cracking down harder than ever on unlawful non-citizens. If you're in the country without a valid visa, the government is making sure you don't stay for long.